collaboration between George Mason University, home campus at Farifax, and our campus here at Mason Korea in Songdo. And we're really excited to have this opportunity today. A little bit about our campus, for those of you who don't know. Here at Mason Korea, our students come from all over the world, including students from the Farifax campus who come and study with us for a semester or more. In turn, all of our students go to the main campus at Farifax to spend a year there. And Mason Korea is part of George Mason's effort to make its education truly global, and our students benefit. More about us at masonkorea.gmu.edu. Today, like I said, I'm coming to you from our Songdo campus. My name's Melissa Bruce, and I'm going to serve as your moderator for the event today. With the help, of course, of Susie Rigdon and Kara Oakleaf on the main campus, who will help us with questions over there. We here at Mason Korea want to thank the Fall for the Book Festival for this exciting partnership. So Fall for the Book is a festival that runs through Saturday, October 12th, and Fall for the Book is a nonprofit, and all of the events in your program are free. So for more information on the festival or to support our programs, please visit fallforthebook.org. Please remember to silence your cell phones before we get started here, and thank you in advance for filling out a survey which will help us to improve the festival in the future. Now we're going to move on to our events. Today on the Fairfax campus, we have two authors with us, Alice Stevens and Eugenia Kim. Alice Stevens was among the first generation of transnational interracial adoptees. Her work has appeared in Urban Mosaic, Plum, Banana Writers, and the Washington Independent Review of Books, which publishes her monthly column, Alice in Wordland. Eugenia Kim's debut novel, The Calligrapher's Daughter, won the Borders Original Voices Award, was shortlisted for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and was a Washington Post Best Historical Novel and Critics' Pick. Her second novel, The Kinship of Secrets, received a starred review book list and was an Amazon Best Book of the Month Literature and Fiction. She teaches at Fairfield University's MFA Creative Writing Program. So please, everybody, help me welcome Eugenia Kim and Alice Stevens today. All right, to start us off, I think Eugenia Kim is going to give us a little bit of introduction.
Hi, it's great to be with you guys. I'm going to read a little bit and from the Kinship of Secrets. This is a story about two sisters who are separated as a result of the Korean War. One sister, Inja, grows up in Seoul with her relatives, and the other sister, Miran, grows up in America with her parents. It's June 1950, and North Korea has just invaded South Korea. And in this section, Inja is about 4 years old. She's almost 4 years old, and her family have fled from Seoul. So they finally end up at a refugee camp a couple days later. And so she's with her uncle and with a stern aunt and two elderly grandparents. So at this refugee camp, there's a big warehouse that's already filled with refugees. So the family finds a space on the grounds with many other families. Now, grandmother had a stroke last winter, and Inja's mother in America had sent her a metal enameled bedpan. And they all think that the bedpan is like the paragon of American ingenuity. They have left behind in Seoul their cook and her daughter Yoon. And Inja, the thing you need to know is that Inja had a pair of Ked sneakers that her mother sent from America, but they were stolen when she went to pump water. So, by a girl who said, you have to watch out, people steal things around here. Inja's eyes opened to a bright morning, someone shaking her shoulder. Aunt hissed, "Where's the bedpan?" Inja waved towards the cart. "It's not there. Halmini needs it. Go find it." She swept off Inja's quilt. Inja hugged her elbows and looked around. Everything shone from the rain, and though the ground was wet, the mats had kept them dry. Grandfather sipped hot water, the lines on his face carved deep, his eyes hooded, and he crouched in that particular way that meant his back pained him. The cart was upended. "I put it against that wheel," said Inja to Aunt. "Aigu, someone stole it. You should have hidden it." "Where's Uncle?" Perhaps Uncle had moved it when he turned the cart. "He's gone to get the servants and to find us an inn." So much had happened that it didn't surprise Inja to learn that he would attempt to help Cook and Yun get out of Seoul, where now there was war. Inja wanted Cook and Yun, but she wanted Uncle back too. She shut her eyes and said a prayer. An aunt flapped the quilts and yelled at her to find out who stole the bedpan. Inja tugged on dry socks and her rubber shoes, her face sour. Aunt shoved her hip and said, "Do as you're told. What kind of child acts like that? It's no wonder your mother left you behind." Her usual rant, and one impossible to ignore. Inja plowed through the bundles piled beneath the overturned cart, resentful and certain Aunt wouldn't have said that if Uncle were around. She skirted people's camps and sloshed through puddles. She tripped on a root and pain surged through her toe. She seethed at her thin rubber shoes, that thief of a girl, and swore to stray all day to avoid Aunt, though her stomach rumbled. After she used the latrine, she dawdled at the warehouse's cavernous opening, addled enough by anger to want to beat up the girl who stole her shoes. Then, far beyond the pump, she glimpsed a familiar white oblong, and she strode toward it with purpose. There was the bedpan, balanced on stones over a small fire, a woman stirring something in it. Inja neared and smelled onions and soy sauce in its smoke. She ran back to Aunt. "I found it. Come and see." Aunt followed her, fingers curled like a hawk's talons. But when she saw the woman cooking with the bedpan, she stopped and clutched Inja's shoulder. "Hush, let's go back." At their camp, Grandmother fanned embers beneath the old iron cookpot boiling water. In the other pot, fresh barley rice had been shaped into balls. Aunt told her about the bedpan. "That poor woman didn't know better. We can't say anything now." Grandmother agreed they'd make do without it. Then they snickered, heads lowered. "She'll wonder why her soup tastes so delicious," said Aunt. "Wait until Cook hears about that special seasoning," said Grandmother. And they laughed aloud, mouths covered in modesty. In this desperate place where people stole things, certain manners, such as saving face, even for strangers and thieves, still mattered. Inja had wearable shoes, and the family had 2 cookpots that could forego a prized bedpan and a coveted pair of sneakers. Later that morning, Inja spread blankets out to dry, pumped buckets of water, and Grandmother showed her how to lay hot compresses on Grandfather's back. Then Aunt told her she could do what she wanted as long as she stayed out of trouble. She ran in the steamy fields all afternoon with other children, playing war, and looked in vain for the girl who stole her shoes. Uncle stumbled back into the camp after midnight, and Inja crawled from bed to give him a relieved hug. Covered in soot, his clothes smelling of metal and smoke, Uncle's eyes were empty circles of black in the firelight. Aunt shooed Inja back to bed, and the long shadows cast by the fire and their quiet talk drew her deep into a sleep layered with sadness that neither Cook nor Yun had been rescued from Seoul. Thank you.
Thank you so much for providing the reading for us. So next we're going to have Alice Stevens do a bit of introduction or possibly a reading as well.
Thanks. Hello, everybody in Korea. Hello, everybody here in Fairfax. It feels so very 21st century to be doing this. It's thrilling. So my book is Famous Adopted People, and it is about an adoptee, a Korean American adoptee named Lisa and her best friend Mindy, and who is also adopted. Mindy goes to Korea to find her birth mother, and she asks Lisa to go along, and Lisa says, okay, though she's a little ambivalent about finding her birth mother. They get in a big argument, and so Lisa has stormed off. Her friend Mindy has told her she doesn't want her to come meet her birth mother. She wants her to go home because she's just too selfish and likes to party too much. So she's now at a restaurant. She is called a fixer from the agency Mother Finders to come and get her, and he has appeared. As Harrison pushed his empty bowl away and softly burped into his loosely curled fist, I asked, "Your name isn't really Harrison, is it?" "No," he admitted, "it's not." I waited for him to volunteer his real name, but he didn't. So I asked, "What is your real name?" I was often asked the exact same question, and it annoyed the hell out of me, both because Lisa Pearl was my real name, and because I was forced to admit that I did have another name, a foreign name, given to me at birth. I'm pretty sure it annoyed the hell out of him, too. He paused before answering. "It's Ji-hoon." "Ji-hoon," I tried it out. "That's nice. Do you mind if I call you Ji-hoon?" "No, not at all," he shrugged. "They ask us to use English names at Mother Finders, and so I picked Harrison." "After Harrison Ford?" I hazarded. He nodded glumly, staring past me at a poster of a man determinedly chugging a quart bottle of OB beer, sweat beading his brow from the effort. I like movies. Because I seemed to have offended him, I cast about for something complimentary that didn't involve his beauty. "Your English is excellent. Did you study in America?" "Oh, really?" His bushy eyebrows perked up a little. "Thank you. I was fortunate enough to have a really good tutor, an American man, Mr. Smith." Q Buck emerged from the kitchen to clear our bowls. "Min-hee?" he asked with a wistful tone. I felt my cheeks splotch with heat. "Min-hee? She and I, she's busy today." I looked hopelessly at Ji-hoon, who obligingly said something in Korean to Q Buck. Q Buck grinned, looking at me with raised eyebrows as if we were sharing a good joke. His wife dropped some dishes in the sink with a loud clatter, and he disappeared into the steam, their barbed voices tangling together as they bickered at each other. Groaning, I dropped my head in my hands. "I'm ready to go to your friend's apartment now, Ji-hoon." Ji-hoon insisted on paying, and he settled the bill with Q Buck. Q Buck's wife emerged from the misty recesses of the kitchen, and arms folded over a teddy bear picking daisies in a meadow, blinked belligerently at me through the fringe of permed hair that wilted over her forehead like a freshly used mop. Ji-hoon took hold of my rolling suitcase and preceded me to the door. "Go back to where you came from," Q Buck's wife spat at me. "Go home." "What?" I stopped my weary drift toward the door. "Since when did you speak English?" Waving her thin arms as if to waft me out the door like a pesky fly, she screamed, "Go home and don't come back." I stood in shock. I looked in shock at Q Buck, who was tucking Ji-hoon's money into the cash register. He did not meet my eyes, but intently began to stack coins into tidy columns in the money drawer. Ji-hoon tugged at my arm, pulling me to the door. "Come on, let's go." "Go home!" the wife, shrieking, followed us down the street. "What was that all about?" I asked. "Don't pay her any attention. Some Korean people are crazy." Ji-hoon shook his head mournfully. "I had no idea she spoke English," I stammered. "This whole time, while Q Buck and I were trying to communicate, she could have translated. Fucking bitch." We rounded the corner onto the wide avenue back in the other Seoul, where people with necks twisted to their cell phones rushed toward important business meetings. The subway shuddered underneath our feet. Shop girls in neat uniforms waited at doors with hands folded precisely together in front of them. Ji-hoon seemed to relax a little. He pulled out a cigarette. Some people are uncomfortable in the presence of Korean adoptees. They think of it as a national shame. He paused, his lighter poised in the air, cigarette waggling in his mouth as he finished his thought. Especially women feel this way. Maybe she gave up a baby herself. Who knows? That stopped me in my tracks. That woman could be my mother? Mindy's mother? Except no. Mindy's birth mother was right now dressed in her best hanbok, sipping tea with Mindy and her parents, holding Mindy's hand and tearfully explaining just why she had to give up her precious baby daughter.
Right. Thank you so much for that reading, for both of you, for reading for us today. Next, we're going to move to a question portion. So I would like to pose some questions for both of you to start us out before we move on to the audience Q&A. All right. Some of these questions, just as a side note, have come from my students. So they helped me to develop some of these questions for you today. First, why did you become writers, and what made you write these specific novels?
So let me tell you a little story first, which is sort of one of the reasons why I became a writer. My grandmother had no toenails, and it was something that we learned about 10 years ago. She lost them as a result of walking 2 hours every day in ice and snow to the prison where my mother had been imprisoned during the Japanese occupation. So my mother was in prison for 90 days, and grandmother went every day to bring her rice. So that long trip caused her to have frostbite, and over the years she lost her toenails. And I've done research on frostbite, and it's just a very long and slow and painful process for that to have happened to her. Yet she never said anything to my mother. My mother never knew this. It was only something we found out just recently, long after my mother had passed. So these are the kind of stories that come out of my family. And as a result of these amazing stories, I felt I had a compelling need to tell them. And also because they were a way for me to capture my Korean identity since I was raised American.
Well, my reason isn't quite as lofty as Eugenia's. I just always liked to read, and from a very small child, reading was my favorite activity. And as I grew bigger, I said, well, maybe I could do that too. And I started writing, first in a journal and letters. And then in middle school, I started writing really boring, silly stories that had no plot. And I kind of graduated from there. It was a lifelong project. I did also want to write about my experience as an adoptee. There have been a lot of books written about adoptees that aren't written by adoptees, and a lot of them get the adoption story wrong. So I did want to write an adoption story that was a genuine story.
All right, thank you so much for those answers. To move forward, my next question is actually, I think you've spoken a bit to that already, especially Eugenia, but my students were interested to know what parts of your novels represent real experiences that you've had.
Well, the Kinship of Secrets is based on my sister's story. So I had always assumed that my sister came to us when she was 11 years old, separated from the family because of the Korean War, like I said. So I always thought that, immigrants coming to America, what a wonderful thing. Everyone would be dying to come to America. Streets, filled with coins, etc. Golden Mountain. But it was only maybe in 2005 that I asked her, what was it like for you to come here? And I had never thought to ask her before. And she said it was the blackest day of my life. And so I thought, oh, that's a really different story. And so I began to interview her, and most of the material in the Kinship of Secrets is taken from the stories that she told me about her life and about her journey to America.
My book is Lisa is not me, but we share a lot of the same biographical details. We're both adopted, we were both born in Korea, we're both mixed race, and we both kind of had rough adolescences where we acted out. But Lisa's mistakes are her own and not mine, because this is a work of fiction. But the adoption story is the basis of this book, and that is my story. So there, a lot of the issues that Lisa deals with are the issues that I also had to deal with.
All right, thank you so much. I actually would like to ask a quick follow-up to Eugenia. I'm curious, why did you wait for so long to ask your sister about that experience?
There's a lot of secrets in my family, and I think that in a family that has secrets, there's just things you don't ask. Also, she is 6 years older than I am, so all the time we were growing up, we had very different lives. You know, now 6 years is nothing when I'm, you know, well into my mature years, but back then 6 years was quite a distance. So it was, and then she lived in a different state than I. So it was when we took my first trip to Korea, and I went with her. She had been back many times. That's when I asked her, and that was like the right setting to ask.
Thank you. The next question that I have for you, again, this feeds on to the previous two, but my students developed this question. They were curious, when writing your novels, did you feel the need to put aspects of yourself into the characters? It sounds from your previous answers that the answer to that is probably yes in some way. But then they go on to ask, what parts of yourself did you incorporate, and did writing these novels help you to resolve any struggles within yourselves?
Yes. So Lisa's identity issues are in a big way mirror my identity issues. As an adoptee, and especially as a transracial adoptee, that means an adoptee who is adopted into a family that is not the same race as she is. So as a transracial adoptee, there are many identity issues that many of us do face, and so I wanted to write those, but I won't, as I said before, it's fiction. It's not something. I was not willing to write about myself in such an honest way, which is why I fictionalized it. And that gave me a lot more freedom to exaggerate things, to play with the story, and to, you know, obviously make it more of a better read, because real life, you know, was usually not as exciting or thrilling as it is in novels.
So true. So true. Yeah, so fictionalizing real life is really hard work. Mostly because once you start, so in the Kinship of Secrets, the character Miran is, a lot of her experiences are my experiences, since I grew up in America and had identity problems that similar to Miran's struggle. But something happens when you begin to write a character that there becomes a departure from yourself. The character takes on their own personality, their own aspects of life, and it's not you anymore. It becomes that character, and it's unique and separate from who you are. So, and that process, and this is why so many people become writers, that process is a way to grow out of yourself as well, because you have to separate from yourself in order to be able to write a character that's based on yourself. So, and the way to do that is to have objectiveness. And so that objectivity helps to, you know, see yourself in a different light.
Yeah, and you asked if it helped to resolve any of my own character issues, or and yes, it did. Writing about adoption clarified a lot of my feelings about adoption, and then also made me understand that I did want to go forward and try and find my birth mother. And I did want to look into, you know, what my origins were. Since I wrote the book, I've found my birth father, who's actually deceased, but I found my half-brother and other part of the family. I've also connected a lot with more adoptees and been more aware of, you know, the whole world of adoptees out there, which has been really great for me.
Let me just add something about something that I mentioned earlier about forming a Korean American identity. So when I wrote the first book, The Calligrapher's Daughter, it's my mother's story. And my mother and I were always estranged because I didn't speak Korean. So, you know, and her English was not so great. So our communication was very broken. When I wrote her story, it was a way for me to understand what her life was like. And then also I had to research Korean history because I knew very little. You don't learn that in school in America. So doing all that research about Korean ancient history through the colonial period in great detail was very informative to me, and also made me understand something about my own history through my mother, through my father, and through that research. So as a result of that, I was able to accept, you know, the phrase Korean American, I am Korean American. Whereas before I was always just, I'm American, you know. So yeah, it definitely made a change.
Thank you so much for those answers. Moving forward, both of your novels deal significantly with themes of family and loss and identity. And so I'm curious, specifically, there seems to be a kind of ghost of family loss that haunts both of them in very different ways, but seems present in both of your novels. So how does these family losses inform the development of your characters' identities while you were writing them?
Well, for an adoptee, family loss begins at the very beginning when you're separated from your birth parents. And that is a trauma that begins your life. I mean, it depends how old you are when you're adopted. I was adopted as a baby, so I never knew anything but my adoptive family. They are a wonderful family. I love them with all my heart. They raised me, you know, as one of their own, and they're great people, and they were good in raising a child of another race. But still, inside every adoptee, or I can't speak for every adoptee, but most adoptees, there is that initial separation from your family, that from your birth family, that will last your whole life. You don't know your origins. You don't know where you come from. You don't know if you have medical history that you have to be aware of. And then especially when you are adopted into a family of another race. I was adopted into a Caucasian family, which is the norm, that Caucasian families will adopt people from other races. You know, there is that weird feeling of you have nobody around you looks like you. People tell you that you look different, and you say, "What? How? You know what? I'm part of this family. Why do you always make me feel different than them?" So you know, the story of an adoptee is the story of family loss, and yeah, there's just no way to get around that.
I'm not sure. Well, in the Kinship of Secrets, I think for Miran, the sense of loss is not so much family loss, but loss of culture. She grows up just absorbing culture without really having it. So that's problematic for her. And for Inja in Korea, her family, her relatives are her family, but her mother and father and her sister she only knows them by photographs and by letters. So she regards them as ghost people because they're not really real. The first time she has a conversation with her parents is when she's 15 years old because collect calls were impossible to make back then. So, she doesn't even remember ever having a conversation with them. So there's that sense of loss as well. But I think for Miran, it's more a sense of cultural loss than it is, because she has her parents there, so.
Right.
I also, sorry. I also think that there's very Korean stories of the separation from your family. It's just because of the Korean War and the separation. From that, families were torn apart, and you just have so many families who have stories of separation, whether it was because of the split between the countries or because of the social conventions of the time, or because the adoption works so well to get rid of the mixed race kids that it kind of got expanded in Korea to include non-mixed race people, to include children whose parents were married, who had other siblings, but they just couldn't afford to keep the children and gave them up for adoption.
Thank you so much for your responses. Now, I'd like to open it up to our audience. So the plan here is to go back and forth between campuses. So if I could, I'm going to ask our campus here at Songdo, does anyone have a question for our authors? I know some of you have questions. Chris?
Thank you very much for some very moving readings and for your reflections on your experiences. I'm wondering, my question would be, if for either one of you, what do you, has the process of writing these respective novels affected your perception about identity, or your thoughts about the role of identity in life? Do you feel the same way about the significance of identity in your life now, as opposed to before you wrote this novel?
No, I don't feel the same way. Anytime you do an exploration of character through fiction, you are exploring not only your own identity, but someone else's as well. And so, like I said earlier, that objectivity informs your own view of yourself. So it's not like journal writing, but it is like putting something outside of yourself on paper in a tangible way that that you can see, that you can read, that other people will read. And it's an extraordinary experience to have readers, because what has been so silently in your own mind and in your own pen suddenly is in public. And that also helps to shape, I think, a writer's identity. So definitely, I mean, not being a writer and then becoming a writer because you have a book that gets published, that changes, that's a very dramatic change of identity.
Yeah, I agree that my feeling also, my feelings about my own identity changed after I wrote this book. I wrote the book very quickly, and it was just, a whole lifetime of my feelings about adoption that I got down into a book along with, just my whole worldview. And then after I wrote it, I kind of, felt the implications of what I wrote. And that kind of changed, made me look at what I had been feeling inside made me look at it with a more critical eye, and made me feel more, made me more connected with the adoption community, which I think is important for adoptees to have that community. And just also, I recently went to Korea, and on that trip to Korea, I, felt a little more allegiance with Korea. I felt a little more like I was Korean. I had a lot of anger and resentment toward Korea, and this trip that I took really helped me to sort of reconcile my feelings.
Right.
I think we're still here.
Are we still here? Can you still hear us?
We can hear you.
Okay, all
We can
right.
hear you.
Okay,
We
so
have a question. We have a question here. If
Please.
we want to have that question and maybe out the video.
How do you see this evolution of identity for, say, for example, the next generation, your next generation, my next generation? Meaning, is a perfect identity? Is it say, for example, what's a perfect American identity? Is it something that you see in your definition? Is it saying, like one of my friends said, oh, I don't see any color, I don't see any country, I don't see any gender. That's perfect American identity. Is it losing your, say, your Korean identity? How do you really become an American, true blue American, is what I was thinking. How does it all end? Where does identity end, is what I'm saying.
Well, hopefully in my mature years, as I said, it never ends. It's not a finite thing. A sense of identity is constantly changing. And I don't think it can be defined as a group. It's such an individual thing that to generalize and say, what is an American identity would be, well, what is your American identity? What is my American identity? And mine is Korean American identity. And I was unable to embrace that Korean part until I had learned more about Korea and visited there. And like Alice, sort of understood that these people are my people as well as the people here. These are my people too. So I think that's where identity comes, is like, who do you feel aligned with? And it's like everybody in this room, there's a great mix of people here. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think identity is something that never stops. You always have an identity, and if you are a thinking person, it should always be evolving. You should never just say, I am this, and then that's you for the rest of your life. You should always be thinking about things, learning about things, and I think America itself is learning a lot about things that they, before the identity was a white male, right? And now, we're allowing in all other types of identities, and that's been going on for decades. What is the future of an American identity? I don't know, but I think that it is some kind of balance between honoring your origins and also being a part of this great American country.
And in terms of the next generation, when I started to write, I could list all the Korean novels, Korean American novels, on a single piece of paper. But now there's, there's hundreds, and all different kinds. There's mysteries, so the variety is amazing. So it's like, the isolation that I felt from just having a page of books compared to what's happening now, where there are pages and pages. And I think that's, that's just going to help the next generation form their own multicultural identity.
Right, thank you. Let's open it up over here again. Would anyone like to volunteer a question on the Songdo side? Go ahead.
Yeah. My question is actually, I also had a dream of becoming a writer, but I quit because for the first 20 minutes I write something out of my head, but I get run out of my imagination and creativity, so that's why I quit. So I think the most challenging challenging factor as a writer, well, of course, I'm not a professional writer, so what do I know? But I think the most challenging factor is when you're something and you run out of creativity and imagination, you cannot move forward, right? So what do you do when you run out of the imagination? Do you go for a walk, or do you read other guys' novels, or what do you do?
I read. So when I get stuck, which is often, or when my imagination feels depleted, or when I get forgetful, I go for a walk, or I'll start reading something. And it can be anything. It can be anything that interests me. But the very act of reading somebody else's words and the way they put sentences together and the way they choose words is inspiring to be able to see that. And just see the differences, how a sentence that I might write saying one thing and another person writes a similar sentence trying to say that same thing, they're going to be completely different. So that uniqueness in every certain writer's work is an inspiration. And so that's where I get my inspiration.
Writing is a long-term thing. It's not just like you sit down and write, and then you're done. You really have to work at it. And so one thing is just to get your butt in the chair every day and write. And even if it's an off day, you write. And you just get it down. And what I do is I'll have a word count for the day. And I write until the word count. And even if, it's shit, I've got it, I've done it, and I can say, okay, and, maybe the next day it'll be better. Also, I like to swim. There's nothing to do, there's nothing to see, you're just going back and forth, and then I let my mind go and ponder, think about how I'll get through, the corner I painted myself into or whatever. But yeah, really my advice to you is to just sit down every day and write.
All right, thank you so much for those answers and for that question. Is there anyone on the Farifax side who would like to ask a question?
We actually have a question from somebody who's tuning in online remotely that I'd like to read out. And it says, Ms. Stevens, you said you were angry at Korea until you went there, but you also said you were raised well by a loving family. So how were you hurt by your Korean parents? Did you feel a sense of not belonging as a child?
Yes, I did feel a sense of not belonging as a child and as an adult. When you are raised in an atmosphere where you are the only one who looks like you, it can be very difficult, and it can be, when you're the center of attention but not in the way that you want to be, you're kind of this exotic thing that people feel free to comment upon, to say, oh, aren't you so lucky? And to just make presumptions about you, just to, come up to you, total strangers, and like comment on your existence. It's not fun. Was I angry at my birth parents? my feelings about adoption evolved when I was young. I didn't really know very much about it, and I didn't really care to know much about it. I kind of ignored it. But as you get older and you're much more sensitive to people, it's hard to ignore. And as I got older, I understood better the story of my birth mother and my birth father. It's a typical story. My birth father was a soldier in Korea, and my birth mother was a woman who worked around the camps. They had apparently a 13-month relationship. She was 6 months pregnant when he went back to America. He knew that she was pregnant, and but he didn't claim me. So yeah, I had a lot of angry feelings. Not, I guess in the beginning to my mother too. Later that was more towards my father. And then later, as I learned more about the reality, about why adoption started in Korea and what happened with it, I became angry at Korea. But you know, after time, you just have to deal with it. And the way that I dealt with it was I wrote this book, and now I've, you know, kind of trying to find out more about my origins.
Thank you so much for your responses. So we've only got about 5 minutes left, so this will likely be our last question. Was there anyone else on the Fairfax campus who wanted to pose a question?
I have one. You speak of the anger, and I imagine there was a lot of frustration on both of your parts when you were growing up. How did that manifest when you were younger? Because I know that that's different for every child. So how did it manifest for you?
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Me too.
Being rebellious, just really self-destructive behaviors, and being a troubled young person. Because of the sense of isolation that you feel when you're the only one. And so you just lash out, and you lash out at yourself. So, yeah.
And the expectations that people have for you, I'm sure, you know, with your Korean family, you know, you just, to reject all of that, just, you rebel. And I rebelled. I was a very difficult teen. I'm sorry, Mom and Dad. You know, I think I made their life quite difficult when I was a teenager. And I would say that was my young teens, when I was about 13 to 16. But when I was 16 to 21, I was better, but I still wasn't great.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you guys so much. This is a question about famous adopted people, and it's not an autobiographical question, it's a formal question. I love the book, and I loved the unexpected turn. You were talking about rebellion, and I felt like as I was reading the book, there was something very rebellious about the way that book started out, realistic, and then woo, kidnapping, North Korea, bunkers, you know, all this, you know, it felt like I was in a very different genre. And that I wanted to ask if you had anything you could share about your decision to kind of make that turn in the kind of story you were telling and how you were telling it. I really loved it.
Thank you. Well, you know, you have to make an interesting book. You can't just write a book about nothing. So I've always been fascinated with North Korea. Who isn't? And I've always seen Korea as a very good metaphor for being adopted. You know, half of you is kind of a modern Western success story, and the other half is a dark and unknowable, you know, territory. So I thought that it would make, you know, I would placed it in Korea both because that's my birthland and because it's a great metaphor for being adopted. I've long been fascinated with the Kim dynasty, and it just seemed like a perfect thing to make Kim Jong-un into one of the main characters in my book. It was very fun to write about him. It was just kind of where my imagination took me, and it seemed right. And I wanted to also make a book that was about adoption, but also express my worldview. And so there's that's where all the consumerism, the plastic surgery, the corruption, corruption is, it's everywhere. It's not just in North Korea, it's here too. And show that the world made North Korea, that North Korea didn't just spring up, from, people didn't want to be enslaved by these wicked dictators, that North Korea is there because of America, it's there because of Russia, China, we all made North Korea. So I thought that was an important point to make in my book.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are just about out of time. So with our last minute, all I want to say is, first of all, thank you, Paul, for the book and Susie for your help. But most importantly, thank you so much to Alice Stevens and Eugenia Kim for joining us and for making this happen across continents. It was an absolute pleasure to hear from you and to read your books. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you, Susan.
Oh, all right.
All right.